No one can explain what keeps returning to Appalachia and why it's stopped leaving. Few people know, but buried deep within the oldest mountains in North America lies a pattern so disturbing, so relentlessly consistent across generations that historians, researchers, and even government officials have quietly chosen to look away rather than confront what it truly means. The Appalachian region stretches across 13 states, from the rolling hills of southern New York to the deep forests of northern Alabama, yet there are specific valleys, specific hollows, specific stretches of land where something has been happening for over 200 years, something that defies rational explanation. Not because it involves anything beyond the natural world, but because human behavior itself, when isolated long enough, when pressed by poverty, neglect, and systematic erasure, begins to warp into something unrecognizable. What you are about to hear was never meant to be compiled into a single narrative. These events were scattered across crumbling county records, sealed court documents, faded letters in forgotten archives, and testimonies that were deliberately misfiled or destroyed by officials who understood the implications of what they had discovered. But when you lay them side by side, when you trace the exposed thread that connects one generation to the next, you begin to see a shape that keeps returning, a cycle that refuses to break. This is not folklore. This is not legend. This is not the invention of a storyteller seeking to frighten you. This is documented history that was hidden because the truth it revealed was too uncomfortable for the nation that allowed it to happen. By the end of this story, you will understand three things. First, you will understand why entire communities in Appalachia were systematically abandoned by every institution that was meant to protect them. Second, you will learn about a practice so normalized within these forgotten places that it continued for decades without a single intervention, without a single arrest, without a single voice raised in protest. And third, you will discover what finally stopped it and why that ending may be more disturbing than the cycle itself. If you leave before the final chapter, you will miss the piece that makes everything fall into place. Stay until the end. What waits there has never been told in full until now. The mountains of Appalachia are ancient, older than the Rockies, older than the Alps, older than the Himalayas, older than almost any mountain range still standing on this planet. They were formed nearly 480 million years ago, when the continents themselves were still finding their shape. Time has worn them down, smoothed their once jagged peaks into gentle curves covered in dense, impenetrable forest. Oak, hickory, pine, and poplar blanket the slopes so thickly that sunlight struggles to reach the forest floor. In summer, the humidity turns the air into something you can almost drink. In winter, fog settles into the valleys and refuses to leave for days. To outsiders, to tourists driving through on scenic highways, these hills appear peaceful, even beautiful. Postcards show covered bridges and autumn leaves and quaint cabins with smoke rising from stone chimneys. But to those who have lived within these mountains for generations, the landscape tells a different story. The mountains are not gentle. They are walls. They are barriers that kept the world out and kept the people in. They are prisons made of stone and timber that took centuries to build and that no one ever chose to escape. And what happens when a population is kept in long enough, when roads are never built, when schools are never funded, when doctors never arrive, when lawmakers pretend an entire region does not exist, when the government treats millions of its own citizens as expendable, is something that no one wanted to document. But documents exist. They are fragmented, yellowed with age, scattered across dozens of county archives in buildings that themselves are crumbling from neglect. Many were intentionally destroyed by officials who understood what they contained. But enough remain. Enough to see the shape, enough to trace the pattern, enough to understand why it keeps returning. In the early 1800s, as the young American nation expanded westward, chasing the promise of open land and limitless opportunity, the Appalachian region was already considered a problem. The terrain was too steep for profitable agriculture. The soil was thin, rocky, unsuitable for the cotton and tobacco that drove the southern economy. The winters were harsh, the summers were oppressive, and the people who had settled there, mostly of Scots-Irish descent, refugees from poverty and persecution in the Old World, had developed a culture of fierce independence and deep suspicion of anyone who came from outside their hollows. They did not want roads because roads brought strangers. They did not want government agents because government agents brought taxes and rules and interference. They did not want missionaries because missionaries brought judgment and demands for change. They did not want census takers because census takers asked questions that were none of their business, and so, for the most part, the government obliged. It decided these people were not worth the effort. It left them alone. At first, this isolation was survivable. Families grew their own food in small plots carved into hillsides. They built their own homes from timber they felled themselves. They created their own laws, their own justice, their own ways of settling disputes. When someone wronged a neighbor, the community handled it internally. When someone needed help, the family provided. The outside world was distant, irrelevant, a place spoken of in cautionary tales but rarely visited. For a generation, perhaps two, this system functioned. But as the decades passed, as the Civil War tore through the nation and Reconstruction failed to reach these forgotten hills, isolation began to take its toll. The roads that connected other regions remained unbuilt in Appalachia. The schools that educated children in other states did not exist here. The doctors who treated illness elsewhere never arrived. And something else began to happen. Something that would only become visible a century later when researchers finally started asking the questions that no one had wanted to ask. Why did certain patterns keep appearing in the same hollows, the same valleys, the same family names, generation after generation? Why did certain behaviors persist long after they should have been recognized and stopped? Why did entire communities seem to exist in a different century, following rules that had no place in modern society? The first documented case that fits the pattern was recorded in 1847 in a small hollow in what is now eastern Kentucky. A county official tasked with assessing property for tax purposes made the difficult journey into a valley that had no official name on any government map. The trail was barely passable, choked with undergrowth and fallen timber. It took him 2 days to travel a distance that would have taken 2 hours on a proper road. When he finally arrived, he found 17 people living in 4 crude structures. Walls of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, roofs of wooden shingles that leaked in the rain, floors of packed earth, no windows, no chimneys, just holes in the roof through which smoke from cooking fires slowly escaped. All 17 residents shared the same surname. The official noted in his report that they were hostile to his presence from the moment he arrived. They spoke in a dialect so thick with archaisms that he struggled to understand even basic sentences. The children, of whom there were 9, appeared malnourished. Their bellies were distended, their hair was thin and brittle. Several showed signs of developmental difficulties, struggling to speak or respond to questions appropriately for their apparent ages. The official also noted something else, something he did not fully understand at the time. He wrote that the community seemed to operate under its own rules, its own hierarchy, entirely disconnected from any external authority. The eldest man in the group, a figure the others referred to only as the father, appeared to hold absolute authority over every decision, every resource, and every person within the hollow. He decided who ate and how much. He decided who slept where. He decided who could leave the hollow and when, which appeared to be never. The women did not speak unless spoken to. The children did not play. Everyone worked from dawn until the light failed in service of the family unit. The official attempted to interview the younger adults separately, hoping to understand the structure better, but he was prevented at every turn. The father insisted on being present for every conversation. The others glanced at him before answering any question, as if seeking permission to speak. The official left after 2 days. He was not threatened explicitly, but he understood that his presence was not welcome and that extending his stay would be unwise. His report was filed with the county seat and promptly forgotten. No follow-up was ever conducted. No investigation was ever launched. No intervention was ever made. The hollow continued to exist, undisturbed, for another 90 years. What the official had witnessed, though he lacked the vocabulary and conceptual framework to describe it, was the beginning of a cycle that would repeat across dozens of similar communities throughout Appalachia over the coming century. A cycle driven not by evil individuals or conscious malice, but by something far more insidious: neglect. Total, absolute, institutional neglect. When a population is cut off from education, from healthcare, from legal oversight, from economic opportunity, from every mechanism by which society monitors and protects its vulnerable members, certain patterns begin to emerge. Power concentrates in the hands of a few, usually the oldest males. Resources are hoarded and distributed according to loyalty and obedience. Children are seen not as individuals with rights and futures, but as labor, as extensions of the family unit, as property to be used. Women become invisible, their voices silenced, their identities subsumed into their roles as mothers and workers. And when there is no outside authority to intervene, when no one is watching, when no one cares, those patterns deepen, they calcify, they become tradition. They become the way things have always been done, and tradition, once established across multiple generations, is almost impossible to break. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. What you are about to hear in the coming chapters will explain why this history was buried, and why the pattern that emerged from these forgotten hollows was allowed to continue for so long. If this story resonates with you, if you believe that hidden history deserves to be uncovered, if you understand that the past is never truly past, then join this channel now. The truth does not protect itself. It needs witnesses. It needs people willing to look at what others have chosen to ignore. The hollow that the county official visited in 1847 was not unique. It was not even unusual. By the late 19th century, similar communities had formed throughout the Appalachian region, from the mountains of Virginia to the hills of Tennessee, from the hollows of Kentucky to the ridges of West Virginia. They shared common characteristics that researchers would later identify as warning signs, though at the time no one was looking for warnings. Extreme geographic isolation, often requiring hours or days of travel to reach the nearest town. A single extended family or small cluster of interrelated families comprising the entire population. A patriarchal authority figure, usually the oldest living male, whose word was absolute law and whose decisions were never questioned. Children who never attended school and often could not read or write. Women who were rarely seen outside the immediate vicinity of the home. And a deep, almost pathological distrust of anyone from outside the community, a suspicion so intense that outsiders were sometimes met with armed resistance. These communities were not truly invisible. Local officials knew they existed. Traveling preachers who ventured into the mountains occasionally returned with reports of primitive conditions and strange customs. Journalists from Eastern newspapers sometimes wrote sensationalized accounts of mountain people living like their ancestors had lived 2 centuries before, as if time itself had forgotten to touch them. But no sustained effort was ever made to integrate these communities into the broader society. No roads were built to connect them to the outside world. No schools were established within walking distance. No social workers were sent to assess the welfare of the children. No medical professionals were dispatched to treat the illnesses that ravaged these isolated populations. The reason was simple and devastating in its simplicity. No one cared. Appalachia was poor. Its people had no political power, no economic leverage, no wealthy patrons, no influential advocates, no voice in the halls of government. They could not vote in meaningful numbers. They could not contribute to political campaigns. They could not organize or protest or demand change. They were invisible in every way that mattered to those who held power. And so, they were left alone, left to develop their own systems of governance, however dysfunctional, left to enforce their own rules, however cruel, left to do whatever they wanted to the people, within their control, however vulnerable those people might be. The first systematic study of these isolated communities was not conducted until 1912. When a team of researchers from a prestigious northeastern university traveled through eastern Kentucky and West Virginia to document living conditions in the region. They were funded by a philanthropic organization concerned about poverty, and they expected to find hardship. What they found exceeded their darkest expectations. In one, hollow, accessible only by a narrow footpath that wound through miles of dense forest, they encountered a community of 34 people, all related by blood or marriage, living in conditions that the lead researcher described in his notes as medieval. There was no sanitation system of any kind. Human waste was deposited in the woods near the dwellings, attracting flies and spreading disease. There was no source of clean water. The community drew its water from a creek that was contaminated by the waste of both humans and livestock. There was no medical care. A woman in the community was suffering from an infected wound that had clearly been festering for weeks. She would likely lose the limb. She might lose her life. The children, who ranged in age from infants to teenagers, all showed signs of malnutrition. Many had rickets, many had parasitic infections, many had developmental delays that the researchers suspected were caused by a combination of poor nutrition and lack of stimulation. But what disturbed the researchers most was not the physical deprivation. It was the social structure. The eldest man in the community, who appeared to be in his 70s, controlled all aspects of daily life with an authority that bordered on absolute. He decided who worked and at what tasks. He decided who received food and how much. He decided sleeping arrangements. He decided who could speak and when. He decided who could leave the hollow, which appeared to be no one, ever. The researchers observed the way other community members interacted with him. There was no affection, there was no warmth, there was only fear. A fear so deeply ingrained that it had become invisible to those who lived within it. They did not question his authority because they could not imagine questioning it. It was simply the way things were. The researchers noted that several younger women in the community appeared to be pregnant. They attempted to determine their ages, but no one in the community kept track of birthdays or ages in any formal way. They attempted to determine the identities of the fathers, but their questions were met with silence or deflection. The eldest man watched these inquiries with cold suspicion, and the researchers quickly understood that pursuing the matter further would be dangerous. After 3 days, they left. Their report was published in an academic journal later that same year. It was read by a few dozen specialists in the field. It generated no public outcry. It prompted no government investigation. It changed nothing. The pattern continued undisturbed. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, as the Great Depression devastated an already impoverished region, conditions in the isolated hollows grew even worse. What little connection these communities had maintained with the outside world, the occasional trade of goods, the rare trip to a distant town, the visits of traveling merchants, largely ceased. Resources became scarcer. Desperation deepened, and the control exercised by the patriarchs intensified in response. Reports trickled out occasionally, fragmentary and unreliable. A county sheriff investigating a property dispute would stumble upon a community that seemed frozen in time. A traveling nurse would encounter children who had never seen a doctor and did not understand what medicine was. A coal company surveyor would find a hollow where no one had been born with a birth certificate, where no one had died with a death certificate, where the entire population existed in a grey zone outside the legal systems that governed everyone else. These encounters were noted, sometimes filed, and invariably forgotten. The people in the hollows were not citizens in any meaningful sense. They had no documentation proving their identity. They paid no taxes because they had no income and no property that the government recognized. They voted in no elections because they were not registered and often did not know that elections occurred. They existed outside the system entirely, and the system in turn pretended they did not exist. It was not until the 1960s, when the war on poverty brought unprecedented federal attention to Appalachia for the first time in the nation's history, that the true scale of the problem began to emerge from the shadows. Think about this and leave your reflection in the comments. What happens to a child born into a place where the only law is the will of one man, where the outside world is described as dangerous and corrupt and filled with enemies, where escape is not just difficult, but literally unimaginable, where the very concept of a different life does not exist? What kind of adult does that environment create? And what happens when that adult finally leaves the hollow, finally encounters the outside world, finally has to function in a society they have never been prepared to understand? Leave your answer below. Social workers fanned out across Appalachia in unprecedented numbers during the 1960s, tasked with identifying communities in need of assistance, cataloging the resources required, and laying the groundwork for federal intervention. They expected to find poverty. They expected to find lack of education and health care and opportunity. What they found in some hollows defied everything their training had prepared them for. They encountered communities that had been operating under the same family structure for over a century, passing authority from father to son across 4, 5, sometimes 6 generations. Communities where the concept of individual rights, the very foundation of American society, had never existed and had never been taught. Communities where children were born, lived their entire lives, worked until their bodies gave out, and died without ever leaving a radius of 10 miles, without ever seeing a paved road, without ever speaking to anyone who was not a blood relative. Communities where the only authority was the patriarch, and the patriarch answered to no one, not even God. The social workers wrote their reports. They documented what they had seen with careful clinical precision. They filed recommendations with their supervisors. They begged for intervention. They described families where children showed signs of severe neglect and developmental damage. They described power structures that resembled nothing so much as small dictatorships, absolute in their control and utterly unchecked by any outside force. They described conditions that would have prompted immediate intervention had they been discovered in any city, any suburb, any town connected to the outside world. But intervention, when it finally came, was complicated in ways that no one had anticipated. These communities were deeply suspicious of outsiders. They did not want help. They did not understand the concept of help as the social workers meant it. To them, the government was not a source of assistance, but a threat, an invasion, an attempt to destroy their way of life. The patriarchs who controlled these hollows had spent their entire lives teaching their families that the outside world was dangerous, that outsiders meant harm, that anyone who offered to help was actually trying to steal, to control, to destroy. and the families believed them. They had no reason not to believe them. They had never encountered evidence to the contrary. Legally, the situation was even more tangled. The adults in these communities, however damaged by their upbringing, however limited in their understanding of the world, were technically free citizens of the United States. They had the right to live as they chose. They had the right to raise their children according to their own beliefs. They had the right to refuse government assistance. They had the right to reject intervention. And if they chose to live in isolation, to deny their children education, to submit to the absolute authority of a patriarch, to continue patterns that had been established generations before they were born, the law had only limited tools to stop them. The courts were not equipped for this. The laws were not written for this. The entire system assumed a baseline of connection, of documentation, of participation in the broader society that these communities had never possessed. A child who was never issued a birth certificate was effectively invisible to the legal system. A family that had never paid taxes, never voted, never received mail, never interacted with any government agency was almost impossible to help through conventional channels. Some interventions were attempted. Children were occasionally removed from the most extreme situations, cases where the neglect was so severe and so undeniable that courts had no choice but to act. Custody battles were fought, sometimes lasting years, as patriarchs and their loyal family members resisted every effort to remove children from their control. A handful of cases resulted in criminal charges. Though convictions were rare, witnesses refused to testify against their own families. Evidence was difficult to gather in communities that had no documentation of anything, and the communities themselves often closed ranks, presenting a unified front of denial and resistance against any outside interference. By the late 1970s, a new reality was becoming clear. The most isolated hollows were slowly emptying. Economic collapse had finally accomplished what government intervention could not. The last of the coal jobs had disappeared. The farms that had provided subsistence were failing. There was simply no way to survive in these places anymore. The young people who could leave, who had the courage and the desperation to defy generations of conditioning, began to slip away. They fled to cities, to factory towns, to anywhere that offered even the slimmest chance at a different life. The communities that remained grew smaller, older, more desperate. The patriarchs who had ruled for decades watched their power erode as their subjects vanished one by one into a world they had always claimed was dangerous and hostile and unsurvivable. But the cycle did not end. It could not end so easily. It simply changed form. The survivors who left Appalachia in the 1960s and 70s and 80s carried something with them. Not just trauma, though they carried that in abundance, buried deep in their bodies and minds, shaping their every reaction and relationship in ways they could not consciously perceive. They carried a template, a model of how families work, how authority functions, how relationships are structured, how the world is organized. And that template, forged in isolation over generations, refined by neglect and reinforced by suffering, did not simply disappear when they moved to a new city or started a new job or married someone from outside the hollow. It lived inside them. It shaped their choices in ways they did not understand. It influenced their relationships in patterns they could not recognize. It determined how they raised their own children, what they tolerated, what they expected, what they believed was normal. And in many cases, it reproduced itself. Researchers began to document this phenomenon in the 1980s. Social workers in Midwestern cities, in southern towns, in suburban neighborhoods far from any mountain hollow, reported encountering families with roots in Appalachia that exhibited the same insular, hierarchical, controlling dynamics that had characterized the isolated communities of a generation before. The families looked different. They lived in houses with electricity and running water. Their children attended school, at least intermittently, but the underlying structure was eerily familiar. A single authority figure, usually male, who controlled all decisions. A family culture of secrecy and suspicion toward outsiders. Children who were isolated from peers, who were taught that the family was the only trustworthy unit, who were raised to obey without question. The template had survived. It had adapted. It had followed the survivors out of the mountains and into the modern world. Therapists who worked with adults who had grown up in these communities documented the long-term effects with growing alarm. These individuals struggled to form healthy relationships outside their family of origin. They struggled to trust anyone who was not bound to them by blood. They struggled to recognize controlling or manipulative behavior because it was the only behavior they had ever known. They struggled to set boundaries, to assert independence, to develop a sense of self that was separate from their role within the family structure. And when they became parents themselves, many of them, despite their best intentions, despite their desperate desire to do things differently, replicated the only patterns they knew. The term that researchers eventually adopted to describe this phenomenon was generational trauma. The concept is simple, but its implications are devastating. Trauma does not end with the person who experiences it. It is not contained within a single lifetime. It is passed down, transmitted through behavior, through parenting, through the very structure of family relationships, through patterns that become so ingrained they feel like instinct rather than learned behavior. A child who grows up watching their parents submit to absolute authority learns that submission is normal, natural, the way things are supposed to be. A child who grows up isolated from the outside world learns that isolation is safety, that strangers are threats, that the family is the only trustworthy structure. A child who grows up believing that family loyalty supersedes all other obligations, including their own well-being and safety and freedom, learns to sacrifice themselves on the altar of that loyalty without ever questioning whether the sacrifice is justified. And when that child grows up, when they become an adult, when they start their own family, they often recreate the only model they have ever known, not out of malice, not out of conscious choice, but because they literally cannot imagine any other way of being. The template is all they have. The pattern is all they know. This is why the cycle kept returning. Not because there was something uniquely wrong with Appalachian culture, not because the people in the hollows were inherently different from anyone else, not because some mysterious curse had settled over those ancient mountains, but because isolation, neglect, and the systematic absence of outside intervention created conditions in which certain destructive patterns could take root and flourish unchecked. And once those patterns were established, once they had been reinforced across multiple generations, they became self-perpetuating. They became invisible to those trapped within them. They became normal. They became tradition. And tradition passed from parent to child across generations is one of the most powerful forces in human society. It survives everything. It survives poverty and displacement and education and therapy and good intentions. It survives because it lives not in the conscious mind, but in the bones, in the reflexes, in the assumptions so deep they are never examined. A case study from 1993 illustrates this pattern with disturbing clarity. A social worker in a medium-sized Ohio city was assigned to investigate a family that had come to the attention of Child Protective Services after neighbors reported concerning behavior. The family consisted of a father, a mother, and 7 children ranging in age from 3 to 17. They had moved to Ohio from a rural area of eastern Kentucky 5 years earlier. The father worked as a mechanic at a local garage. The mother did not work outside the home. The children, all 7 of them, did not attend school. When the social worker first visited the home, she was met at the door by the father. He was polite but firm. He explained that his family did not believe in government interference. He explained that his children were educated at home, as was his right under state law. He explained that they were a private family and simply wished to be left alone. The social worker explained that she needed to speak with the children to verify their well-being. The father refused. He said the children were fine. He said they were being educated. He said there was no problem and no reason for the government to intrude on his family. The social worker returned a week later with a court order authorizing entry into the home and interviews with the children. What she found inside matched the descriptions from the mountain hollows almost exactly, as if a piece of that world had been transported through time and space into an Ohio suburb. The children, all 7 of them, slept in a single room, despite the house having 3 bedrooms. They slept on mattresses arranged on the floor, with the oldest children on the outside and the youngest in the center. The father and mother slept in the master bedroom. The 3rd bedroom was locked. The father controlled all access to food. Meals were prepared by the mother under his direction and served according to a system that the father had established. He ate first, then the mother, then the children, in order of age. The children were not permitted to eat until the adults were finished. The children were not permitted to take food outside of designated meal times. The refrigerator was locked between meals. The mother spoke only when spoken to by the father. She did not make eye contact with the social worker. She answered questions about the children with short, rehearsed-sounding phrases. Yes, they are healthy. Yes, they are learning. Yes, they are happy. When the social worker attempted to speak with her alone, the father interrupted and insisted on being present. The mother did not object. The oldest child, a daughter who was 17 years old, appeared to have never left the house except to move from Kentucky to Ohio 5 years earlier. She could not name the current president of the United States. She could not identify the state she lived in. She knew the name of the city, but could not describe its location relative to any other place. She could not explain what a grocery store was, though she knew that food came from outside the home. She knew only her family, her duties within the household, and the rules that governed every aspect of her existence. When the social worker asked her what she wanted to do with her life, what dreams she had for the future, the girl looked confused by the question. She had no dreams. She had no conception of a future that was different from her present. She had never been taught that such a thing was possible. The case went to court. The 7 children were temporarily removed from the home and placed in foster care while the legal proceedings unfolded. But the case was complicated in ways that the social worker had not anticipated. The father hired a lawyer, a competent and aggressive advocate who argued that the family was simply exercising their constitutional right to raise their children according to their own values. The children were homeschooled, which was legal in Ohio. They were fed, clothed, and housed. There were no signs of physical injury. The family had a different lifestyle than most, but different was not the same as harmful. The state, the lawyer argued, had no right to impose its values on a family simply because those values were unusual. The legal proceedings dragged on for 8 months. Expert witnesses testified on both sides. Psychologists evaluated the children and found significant developmental delays, social deficits, and what one described as a profound learned helplessness, a complete inability to imagine themselves as autonomous individuals capable of making their own decisions. But the defense argued that these issues, while concerning, were not the result of deliberate harm. They were the result of a different parenting philosophy, one that emphasized family cohesion and parental authority. Different, the defense repeated again and again, not harmful. In the end, the judge ruled that while the living conditions and educational deficits were concerning, there was insufficient evidence of direct, actionable harm to justify permanent removal of the children from their parents. The family had agreed to enroll the children in public school. They had agreed to regular visits from social services. They had agreed to family counseling. The children were returned to their parents. Within 6 months, the family had moved to another state. They left no forwarding address. The children were never enrolled in any school in their new location. The social worker who had handled the case learned, years later, that the family had moved 3 more times, always staying ahead of any attempts to follow up on the case. She said in an interview conducted in 2001 that she had known, from the first moment she walked into that house, that the cycle would continue, that those children, raised in isolation and control, conditioned to obey without question, taught that the outside world was dangerous and that only the family could be trusted, would grow up and replicate the same patterns with their own children. They had no other model. They had no other understanding of how families worked, and there was nothing she or anyone could do to stop it. This is the nature of generational trauma. It does not require villains. It does not require monsters. It does not require people who set out to harm. It only requires neglect. It only requires isolation. It only requires the absence of intervention. It only requires looking away again and again until the patterns are set so deep that they become invisible to everyone, including those trapped within them. And once it takes hold, once it has survived across multiple generations, it perpetuates itself with a mechanical efficiency that seems almost designed, though it is not designed by anyone. It is simply the way human beings adapt to deprivation. It is simply what happens when we are left alone long enough in the dark. By the early 2000s, the isolated hollows of Appalachia had largely ceased to exist. In their original form, the last of the extreme communities had either died off as their populations aged beyond the ability to sustain themselves, or dispersed as the final survivors accepted that the old way of life was no longer possible. The mountains that had once been walls keeping people in had been penetrated by roads and cell towers and internet access. The conditions that had allowed the cycle to flourish for over a century no longer existed in the same form. But the cycle itself had not ended. It had simply dispersed. It had fragmented into thousands of individual families scattered across the country, each carrying some portion of the template, each passing it down in modified form to the next generation. Therapists and researchers who studied the phenomenon estimated that the effects of what had happened in those isolated hollows would continue to ripple through American society for at least 3 or 4 more generations, probably longer. The mountains had stopped, keeping people in, but the patterns forged in those mountains were still keeping people trapped. The final question is the hardest one to answer. What would it have taken to break the cycle before it became unbreakable? What would it have taken for the institutions that abandoned Appalachia in the 19th century to intervene before the patterns calcified across generations? The answer is both simple and devastating in its simplicity. It would have taken attention. It would have taken resources. It would have taken people who cared enough to climb into those hollows, to sit with those families, to understand what was happening, to offer alternatives, to demonstrate that the outside world was not the threat the patriarchs claimed it to be. It would have taken a society that believed every child, no matter how remote, no matter how poor, no matter how forgotten, no matter how invisible to those who held power, deserved protection. That society did not exist in the 19th century. It barely exists now, And that is why the pattern kept returning. That is why it stopped leaving. Because the conditions that created it, the neglect and the isolation and the systematic indifference to suffering that does not affect the powerful, have never fully disappeared. They have simply changed form. They appear now in different places, in different communities, in different configurations. But wherever neglect exists, wherever isolation is possible, wherever children are raised, without any outside observation or protection, the cycle waits to begin again. This is the truth that was buried, not because it involved anything supernatural, not because it revealed some unique darkness in the Appalachian soul, but because it revealed something about all of us, about what happens when a society decides that some people are not worth protecting, about what happens when we allow economic convenience to determine which children receive attention and which are left to fend for themselves, about what happens when we look away long enough for patterns to take root, about what happens when we allow the mountains or the poverty or the distance or our own comfort and indifference to become walls that keep people trapped in cycles they never chose and cannot escape. If you watched until here, it is because you could handle the truth. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here so I can know who truly follows these stories." If this narrative moved you, if it made you think about the forgotten places and forgotten people that still exist in every country, in every state, in neighborhoods you might drive past without a second glance, then leave a like. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who might not realize how fragile the line is between being protected and being forgotten. And subscribe to this channel so that you do not miss what comes next. Because this story is not finished. The cycle is not broken. It continues in new forms, in new places, among people who have never heard of Appalachia and would not recognize the pattern if they saw it. And as long as neglect exists, as long as isolation is possible, as long as we allow people to disappear behind walls of our own making, whether those walls are made of mountains or poverty or bureaucracy or simple indifference, what happened in those hollows can happen anywhere. It is happening now, and the only question is whether we will finally choose to see it.